"Please, just make it quick," he said, but the Apache girl chose to save him. Texas Hill Country, October 1876. The wind cut like iron filings. Dry, sharp, and bitter, it hissed through the cedar brush and carried the smell of dust, long dead. I was out checking my snares near the creek, the kind of work that numbs the soul more than it feeds the belly. Same path, same quiet, same ache behind the ribs. The forest had the kind of silence that makes a man think he's trespassing in God's forgotten place. Even the crows were wise enough to keep their tongue. My boots pressed the red clay until something twitched the air, a faint metallic whisper, followed by a snap. Pain tore up my arm before I even saw the wire. My world flipped upside down. The ground vanished beneath me, and a rope yanked tight around my wrist, wrenching my shoulder until I heard the dull pop of bone. The trap swung me like a carcass in the slaughter wind. I cursed between my teeth, tried to reach the hunting knife on my belt, gone. The sun slid through the branches, making the world flicker between gold and shadow. Blood dripped down my arm, hot against the cold air. That was when I realized it wasn't a hunter's snare meant for wolves. It was built for men, the kind used by bounty riders who didn't care what kind of blood they spilled, white, Comanche, or something like me, a mongrel breed, the kind that didn't belong anywhere. My breath rasped in the stillness. I could hear my heart thumping against my ribs and the slow groan of the rope creaking in rhythm. Somewhere behind me, leaves stirred soft, deliberate, too careful to be wind. Something was watching. Then she stepped out of the brush. At first, I thought she was a ghost, born from the land itself, a young woman, her skin the color of copper warmed by dusk, her hair braided with bits of feathers and grass, barefoot, moving like shadow. She had a knife, not polished steel, but a blade shaped from bone, sharp and pale as the moon. She stopped beneath me, her gaze climbing from my boots to my face. Her eyes caught the dying light, black and bright all at once. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Only the wind spoke, whispering through the pines like a sermon. I didn't know if she came to help me or to finish the work the trap had started. My right arm burned, blood dripping into the dirt below, and I felt the world tilt in and out of focus. "If you're gonna kill me," I rasped, "make it clean." Her head tilted, like she was studying a wounded animal that hadn't yet decided whether to bite or beg. Then she started climbing, slow, deliberate hand, foot, breath, each movement careful as prayer. The knife glinted once in the low sun, then disappeared into shadow. The sound of the rope straining filled the air, thick and wet, like sinew tearing. I watched her come closer, until I could smell the smoke in her hair, cedar and ash. The tree swayed with her weight. My pulse roared in my ears. She reached the knot above me and hesitated. Her fingers brushed the rope, then froze. The forest went utterly silent, as if the whole world held its breath, waiting to see what kind of mercy lived in her hands. My throat was raw, and all I could think was, if she cuts that rope, I fall. If she doesn't, I die anyway. Her eyes flicked down to mine. Something passed between us, not words, not even understanding, but a pulse of recognition, strange and human. The knife rose. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The blade bit through the rope. I fell hard. The world went black for a moment, and the breath shot out of my lungs like buckshot. When the haze cleared, she was kneeling beside me, her face half shadow, half light. She said nothing, only tore a strip from her dress and wrapped my bleeding wrist with a tenderness that felt borrowed from another life. I tried to speak, but she pressed a finger to her lips. Somewhere deep in the trees, a horse neighed, then went still. Her eyes darted toward the sound, then back to me. There was fear in them, not of me, but of what might be coming. She whispered one word I didn't understand, soft and trembling, like wind through leaves. Then she pointed toward the hills, urging me to move. And even though pain screamed through every bone, I followed her because the way she looked at me said this wasn't about saving a stranger. It was about saving whatever small piece of goodness the world hadn't yet burned away. When I woke, the world smelled of smoke and pine sap. the kind of scent that clings to a man's memory, half comfort, half warning. My head throbbed like someone had hammered the inside of my skull, and my right arm burned from wrist to shoulder. The ache pulsed with every heartbeat, a reminder I was still among the living. I was lying near a dying fire, the last embers sighing against the chill. My coat was draped over me, stiff with dried blood, and for a moment I thought I'd slipped into one of those half-dreams. The dying get the kind where you see mercy wearing a stranger's face. But the stranger didn't vanish when I opened my eyes. She sat a few feet away, legs folded under her, sharpening that same bone knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of its steel whispering against bone matched the rhythm of my breathing. Her hair caught the firelight, black with a red shimmer, like coal before it turns to flame. A streak of dried blood marked her cheek, not her own. She didn't look up, but she knew I was awake. "You're Comanche," I managed, my voice rough as gravel rubbed between teeth. She stopped sharpening. Her eyes flicked to mine, unreadable, cold, sharp enough to split truth from lies. Then she shook her head once. "Was," she said, her accent heavy but clear. "Now I'm just alive." That word hung between us like smoke. Alive. It sounded less like hope, more like defiance. I tried to sit up. The pain hit like a rifle butt to the ribs. I groaned, and before I could curse, she moved closer, not in a rush, just sure-footed, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. She pressed a hand to my chest, not harsh, not gentle either, and forced me still. Her fingers were rough, her palm warm, and she smelled of earth and wild sage. She said something low in her tongue. The only word I caught was stay. So I did. When she finished wrapping my shoulder with strips of bark and hide, I muttered, "You could have left me for the vultures." She didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire as if deciding whether I was worth the words. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, she said, "Vultures take what is dead. You still breathe." I didn't know whether that was mercy or insult. She went back to sharpening the knife. Sparks jumped from the fire, casting her in flashes of orange and shadow. I watched her hands, the steady rhythm of her motion. No trembling, no doubt. A woman like that had seen worse than blood. She was younger than I first thought, maybe 20, but her face carried years I couldn't count. Eyes like wet obsidian, reflecting everything but revealing nothing. The kind of eyes that remembered. The forest shifted. The wind turned colder, carrying a faint metallic rattle spurs. She froze mid-motion. The knife's edge hovered in the firelight, a gleam of warning. Then she moved quick, controlled scooping dirt over the fire until the world went dark. My pulse jumped. She pointed toward the ridge above the creek and mimed silence, 2 fingers pressed to her lips. We crawled into the brush just as the first horse came into view. 3 riders, lanterns swinging, the light slicing through trees like fire on glass. Their voices were low, but clear enough for the night to carry. Bounty men, I'd known enough of their kind to hear it in the way they laughed. One wore a black duster and carried a Winchester slung across his back. The same type I'd once used hunting her kind. The irony wasn't lost on me. They stopped near the rope trap that had nearly killed me. The leader dismounted, crouched, and touched the blood-stained dirt. The lantern light caught his face, pockmarked, lean, the kind that never smiled for real. "He was here," he said. "Rope's cut." Another spat into the dirt. "Then she's got him. The half-breed's bait." The words hit harder than the fall from that damn tree. So that was their game, use me to find her, or her to find me. Didn't matter which. They'd kill us both before sunrise. Beside me, Taya's breathing slowed to almost nothing. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife. I reached out and caught her wrist. She stiffened, her muscles tight as drawn wire. I shook my head once. She glared at me, eyes like flint. Fury burned there, not just at me but at the world that had turned her into prey. Her lips parted, whispering a single word I didn't know. But the meaning was clear, coward. Maybe she was right, but I'd seen what happens when courage meets rifles. 3 men with Winchesters could turn this clearing into a graveyard in seconds. We waited. The riders talked a while longer, their laughter low and mean, then turned their horses downstream. The lanterns bobbed and vanished into the trees. Only then did we breathe. Taya leaned back against the roots of an old oak, knife still clutched in her hand. The fire was dead, the night alive with crickets and the far-off howl of something wild. When she finally spoke, her whisper barely reached me. "You hunted with them once." It wasn't a question. "I did," I said, "a long time ago." She turned her head, eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. "Then you know what they do." "I know," I said, and the truth scraped my throat raw. That's why I stopped. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hateful either. It was the kind of quiet that builds a bridge, fragile but real. We sat there under the whispering trees, two fugitives bound by different sins. After a while, she reached into her bundle a small pouch, a canteen, and some dried roots. She split them in half and handed me a share. I chewed on the bitter roots. They tasted like dirt and smoke, but they steadied me. The wind sighed through the pines again, softer this time, almost forgiving. I wondered if the land could ever forgive either of us. We walked until dawn, following a narrow trail that wound along the ridge. My legs ached, my shoulders screamed, but her pace never faltered. She moved like she'd been carved from the earth itself, silent, sure, uncatchable. Every time I stumbled, she turned, her gaze sharp as an arrow, waiting to see if I'd break. The forest thinned as the sky lightened. Ahead, the plains opened wide, red dust rolling to the horizon, dotted with cacti and dry sage. A hawk circled overhead, crying out once before gliding east. At the top of the hill, she stopped. The first light broke over the horizon, painting her face half gold, half shadow. She looked back at me, expression unreadable. "You run," she said. "They chase. You die. You stay. Maybe live." It was the closest thing to kindness I'd heard in years. I nodded. Words felt small in that kind of light. She studied me for a heartbeat longer, then turned away. I caught a faint smile at the corner of her mouth, though it vanished before I could be sure. We descended the far side of the ridge. The air smelled of dust and sunrise. My boots sank into soft soil, the color of rust. Somewhere behind us, a coyote howled long, lonely, the sound stretching across the waking land. For the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. Not hope exactly, hope's too pretty, a word for men like me, but maybe the shape of it. Taya walked a few paces ahead, her braid swinging against her back, her knife hanging at her side. Every now and then she'd glance over her shoulder, making sure I hadn't fallen behind. I wondered if she'd keep looking back once she decided I was no longer useful. The thought should have made me wary. Instead, it made me want to keep up. When the sun finally rose, it caught the edge of her cheek and lit her hair like copper fire. She didn't notice, but I did. We reached a dry creek bed by mid-morning. She crouched, studied the sand, and traced a pattern with her fingers' prints, deep and fresh. "Riders," she said. I looked at the trail. "How many?" She pointed to 3 depressions. "Same men. They circle. They won't stop," I said. She stood, eyes narrow. "Then we keep moving. Hills hide us." And so we did. Step after step through a land that didn't care whether we lived or not. When we reached a cluster of dead mesquite trees, she paused. "Rest," she said, motioning to a rock. I sat, wiping sweat from my face. "You always this sure of everything?" She gave me a half smile, the first real one I'd seen. "No, just better at hiding fear." That smile faded as fast as it came, but it stayed with me all the same. We didn't speak again for a long time. The land around us shimmered under the sun, alive with heat and silence, the kind of silence that strips a man bare. By the time the light softened, we had crossed into a stretch of country that even the coyotes avoided. The air buzzed with unseen insects, the sky deepening to copper. We stopped at a high ridge, the plains falling away below us. She stood there, the wind tugging at her hair, looking out over the emptiness. "This land," she said softly, "it remembers everything." I didn't ask what she meant. Some memories don't need explaining. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled not from storms, but from hooves. I turned, scanning the horizon. "They're still coming," she nodded, unfazed. "Always coming." Her voice carried no fear, only fact. I envied that. We started down the other side of the ridge, shadows stretching long ahead of us. two broken pieces held together by the simple will to survive, and maybe, just maybe, something more than survival waiting at the end of it. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. We found shelter in an old mining shack near the ridge, half swallowed by vines and thyme. The place leaned like it was tired of standing. The roof sagged in the middle, and every gust of wind made the timbers groan like a man talking in his sleep. The floorboards creaked beneath our boots, soft with rot, but to two hunted souls, it felt like a church. The air inside smelled of iron dust and rain long gone. Tools lay rusting on bench picks, shovels, a broken lantern, ghosts of hands that once dreamed of gold and died chasing it. I dropped my pack, eased myself against the wall, and let the weight of the day settle on me. Taya moved through the shack without sound. She built a fire in the stove from scraps of old crates and dry pine needles she'd carried in her skirt. Her hands were quick, practiced. Each movement carried purpose. When the first flame caught, the light climbed up her face, copper skin, dark eyes reflecting the blaze. For a moment she looked carved from the same fire she tended. I watched her without speaking. The silence between us had changed. It wasn't fear anymore, and it wasn't safety either. It was something waiting like a question neither of us had the right to ask. She finally broke it. "Why you hunt your own blood?" Her voice was quiet, but the words cut deep. I looked into the fire, watched it spit and twist. "Because I didn't know it was mine," I said. "My father was white, my mother Comanche. The army told me what side I belonged to. I believed them, until I saw what they did to her people." I paused, my throat tightening. 2 hours, her jaw set, the muscle twitching under her cheekbone. "You killed." "Yes." The word came out heavy, tasting of rust and guilt. And I remember every face. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Shadows flickered on the walls, stretching and shrinking like restless spirits. Taya stared at me for a long moment. Her eyes were hard, but not cruel, more like someone judging whether the truth was enough to forgive. Then she said, "If you remember, maybe you not lost." I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe she was right. Maybe memory was the only punishment that mattered. Outside, a branch snapped too sharp to be the wind. Instinct replaced thought. My hand went to my revolver. Taya moved even faster. She swept a handful of sand from the floor and threw it over the fire. The flames hissed and died. Darkness swallowed us whole. Through a crack in the wall, I saw a flicker of light lanterns bobbing between the trees. The bounty men had found our trail. Taya's silhouette leaned close, her breath warm against my ear. "Back door," she whispered. We slipped out into the night, crouched low. The moon carved silver lines along the rocks, turning every branch into the barrel of a gun. My boots sank into damp soil. Her bare feet made no sound. From the woods came voices low, cruel laughter. "They won't get far," one said. "The girl's worth more alive. The half-breed's just noise." Their words crawled under my skin. Every insult I'd ever heard carried the same stink fear dressed up as superiority. Taya's eyes flashed, anger bright as her knife. She started to rise, but I caught her shoulder and pulled her down. "Wait," I breathed. "Not yet." Her glare burned through the dark, but she obeyed. Her fingers tightened around the knife hilt, her knuckles pale in the moonlight. The men stepped into the clearing, 2, maybe 3 shapes of darkness wrapped in dusters. I could smell them before I saw them. Sweat, whiskey, the iron tang of spent gun oil. They fanned out, one holding a lantern high. "Tracks end here," said the tallest. He kicked at the dirt near the shack door. "They hold up inside." "Then flush 'em," the other replied, grinning. "Dog'll do the rest." Somewhere behind him, a hound barked once harsh and close. I raised my revolver, steady despite the fire in my shoulder. My breath slowed. I waited until the lead man turned, light catching his pistol belt, then squeezed the trigger. The report cracked through the trees. He dropped like a puppet with its strings cut. Jows followed. The lantern crashed to the ground, shattering in a spray of flame. The other men shouted, drawing their guns. Taya moved first, a blur of motion and fury. She lunged from cover, knife flashing white in the firelight. She hit the nearest man in the chest, drove him backward into a tree. He gasped once, then went still. I fired again, catching the third in the shoulder. He stumbled, spun, tried to run, but she was already on him. When it was over, the forest went quiet except for the rasp of our breathing. The smell of powder and blood thickened the air. Taya stood over the last man, his face pressed into the dirt beneath her boot. Her hair had come loose, falling wild around her shoulders. A smear of blood streaked her cheek, but her eyes burned bright and clear. "You kill fast," I said. She looked at me, her chest rising and falling. "You taught them." The truth hit harder than any bullet. I'd taught men like that how to kill efficiently, no hesitation, no remorse. The only difference tonight was who'd been holding the knife. I holstered my gun, the weight of it suddenly heavier than before. The night around us seemed to expand, stretching wide and empty, full of all the ghosts I'd made. Taya crouched by the stream behind the shack. She rinsed her hands, the water running red, then brown, then clear again. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were washing away more than blood. I joined her. The water was icy, biting into my cuts, but it steadied me. The stars above looked ancient and patient, bearing witness to our sins without judgment. She glanced sideways at me. Her expression had softened, but only slightly. "Tomorrow," she said, "we find river, cross north." "North to what?" I asked. She shrugged, staring into the current. "Maybe nothing, but not here." I watched the water catch starlight, flowing toward some unseen distance. "Sometimes that's all a man needs," I said, "a direction that isn't backward." For a while we sat in silence, listening to the creek and the wind through the pines. The bodies lay behind us, still and forgotten, but I knew their memory would follow. The West doesn't bury its dead. It just lets them fade into legend. After a time, she spoke again. "You think you can be forgiven?" I didn't answer right away. "Forgiven by who?" She thought about it. "By yourself." The question lingered longer than the gun smoke. I wanted to say yes, that a man could outrun his past, but the truth was heavier. "I don't know," I said, "but I'd like to find out before I die." She nodded once, as if that was the only answer worth trusting. A whip-poor will called somewhere up the ridge. The air cooled, damp with the promise of dawn. I leaned back, letting the sound of the creek lull the tension out of my bones. For the first time in months, maybe years, I wasn't running, not from lawmen, not from memories, just sitting beside a woman who'd saved me twice in one night. Taya looked toward the shack. "You rest," she said. "I watch. I'm not that broken yet. You fall from tree, bleed half night. You broken enough." I almost laughed. Almost. Fair point. She stayed by the water, knife resting across her knees, eyes scanning the dark. I lay down near the fire pit and let exhaustion drag me under. When I woke again, gray light filtered through the trees. Taya was still there, still watching the horizon. The bodies were gone, buried. Maybe burned, I didn't ask. She handed me a strip of dried meat and a canteen. "Eat. We go soon." I chewed in silence, my mind stuck on the calm in her voice. There was no triumph in her, no fear either. Just acceptance, as if violence was a season she'd learned to live through. As we packed, I looked once more at the old shack. Smoke curled faintly from its chimney, the only sign of life it had seen in years. For a heartbeat, I imagined staying, fixing the roof, mending the door, letting time smooth over everything else. But the dream was too soft for the world we lived in. Taya slung her pack over her shoulder. "River waits," she said. "Then we'd better not keep it." We moved out, the trail narrow and winding. The morning sun bled through the mist, turning every drop of dew into fire. She walked ahead, her braids swaying against her back, each step steady. Behind us, the shack disappeared into the trees, swallowed by quiet. Maybe someday, I thought, someone would stumble upon it, find the bullet holes, the dried blood, the half-burned firewood, and wonder what kind of story had been written there. But no one would ever know. Some stories aren't meant to be told. They're meant to be carried in scars, in silence, in the way two people learn to walk beside each other through the ruins of what came before. And as the ridge faded behind us, I realized I was carrying mine too. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. Your body will thank you." The river wasn't far, but the journey stretched longer than it should have. Distance is a strange thing in the desert. It lies to your eyes. What looks close enough to touch might take hours to reach, and what looks impossible might be waiting right over the next rise. My shoulder burned, my ribs ached, and each breath scraped against something sharp inside me. The trail wound through stone and thorn, narrow as a grave in places. Still, Taya kept walking, steady and tireless, her silhouette cutting against the low sun like a blade. Every step she took said she didn't need me, and yet she never once looked back to see if I was keeping up. Somehow that kept me moving. By dusk, the land opened into a valley of red dust and dead mesquite. The sky above was painted in streaks of copper and violet, the kind of beauty that hurts when you've been too long in ugliness. A faint trail of smoke rose from the west, thin, ordered lines, not the wild curl of travelers' fires. I recognized the pattern before my mind caught up. "Soldiers," I murmured. The word tasted bitter. Taya turned, eyes narrowing. "Not them," she said. "Yeah," I breathed. "Cavalry." Her expression hardened, her hand going to the knife at her belt. "They your people," she said flatly. "Not anymore." The wind carried the distant clang of bridles, the rhythmic thunder of disciplined hooves. We moved fast, slipping into a narrow canyon lined with boulders. Shadows stretched long, hiding us for the moment. She glanced at me as we ran, voice low. "You run again." I shook my head. "Not this time." The canyon opened suddenly into a rocky basin. The river shimmered ahead, narrow and fast, cutting through stone like a living vein of silver. The sound of it was both promise and warning: salvation if we made it, death if they saw us crossing. I stopped, scanning the ridge. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. A column of riders appeared against the sunset, rifles catching the last light like teeth. Lieutenant Briggs was among them. I'd know that posture anywhere. Rigid, proud, righteous, a man built on rules that never bent, even when they broke people. Once upon a time, I'd called him brother. I felt Taya's hand clamp on my arm. "They kill you," she hissed. "Maybe," I said. "But if they see you first, they'll kill us both." Before she could stop me, I stepped out into the open. My boots crunched over gravel. The sound was small but final, the sound of a man choosing his path. "Blackthorn?" Briggs's voice carried down the slope, sharp with disbelief. "You're supposed to be dead." "Maybe I should be," I called back. "But I've got something better to do." The other soldiers reined their mounts, forming a half circle behind him. Dust swirled around their horses' legs, mixing with the orange light of the dying Sunday. Behind me, Taya stayed hidden among the rocks. I could feel her eyes on me, tension, fear, and something else I couldn't name. Briggs dismounted, boots hitting the ground with military precision. His gaze flicked from my torn shirt to the rope burns on my wrists. "You helping one of them now?" I met his stare. "One of us." That single word was enough. It broke whatever remained of the man I'd once known. He raised his rifle. I fired first. The sound cracked through the canyon like thunder trapped in stone. The bullet caught his shoulder and spun him sideways. For a heartbeat, everything froze, then the world exploded. Shouts, horses rearing, gunfire echoing from rock to rock until it sounded like the sky itself was falling apart. Taya burst from cover, moving low and fast. "Come," she shouted. I fired again, covering her as we scrambled toward the rocks. Bullets chipped stone beside my head, spraying dust into my eyes. The smell of powder filled the air, sharp and familiar, a memory I'd hoped to forget. We dove behind a fallen log, lungs heaving. My last bullet clicked on an empty chamber. Beside me, Taya crouched, knife drawn, her face streaked with sweat and grit. "They'll circle," I said, panting. "We need the water." She nodded once, quick and certain. The next moment, we were running. Branches tore at our clothes, the sound of hooves closing behind us. The river flashed between trees ahead, white and fast. "Go!" I shouted. She jumped first, vanishing into the cold. I followed, and the shock of the water hit like ice and fire all at once. It dragged at my body, the current stronger than it looked. My wounded shoulder screamed as I fought to stay upright. Taya's head broke the surface a few yards ahead, her braid whipping behind her. "Here!" she yelled, reaching toward me. I caught her arm, and together we kicked toward the far bank. Every stroke a battle. Gunfire cracked above flashes of light on the ridge. Bullets punched into the water with hollow thuds. One passed close enough that I felt it tug at my sleeve. We went under, swept by the current, the roar of the river filling our ears. My lungs burned, and for a moment I thought this was how it would end, dragged down into the dark by my own choices. But then we broke the surface again, gasping, clutching at reeds. When we crawled onto the far shore, the world had gone black except for the stars. They filled the sky, cold and bright, like eyes watching from above. Taya collapsed beside me, chest heaving, her hair plastered to her face. I rolled onto my back, staring at the heavens, letting the wet earth cool the fire in my bones. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The only sounds were our breathing and the distant echo of the cavalry fading into nothing. She turned to me, voice hoarse. "You could run alone," she said. "Why stay?" Her question caught me off guard. Maybe she meant why stay and fight. Maybe she meant why stay with her. Either way, the answer was the same. I looked at her, this woman who'd cut me down from death, who moved through the world like the land itself had chosen her. "Because you cut me down when you didn't have to," I said. "Maybe that's reason enough." Her eyes softened, the fire inside them dimming to warmth. "Many men forget what debt means," she said. "Not this one." She smiled, then small, quiet, like dawn sneaking over the hills. It wasn't the smile of someone forgiving me. It was the smile of someone who'd stopped expecting betrayal for just a heartbeat. The moment didn't last long. The river kept rushing by, cold and relentless, and the night wrapped around us like a second skin. I built a small fire under the cover of a rock ledge, shielding the smoke with my coat. The flames hissed, drying our clothes in fitful bursts. She sat beside me, legs drawn to her chest, staring into the light. "You know them," she said. "Those soldiers." I nodded. "I rode with them once. We thought we were bringing peace. All we brought was graves." She poked at the fire with a stick, sparks rising. "Then why you shoot first?" "Because they'd have killed you," I said. "And maybe because I owed them the truth of what they made me." She didn't answer. The river murmured nearby, constant and forgiving in a way people never are. After a while, she spoke again, softer. "You think we find place they don't come?" "Maybe," I said. "But it won't be on any map." She considered that, then looked up at the stars. "Then we make one." Her words hit me deeper than any sermon. We stayed by the fire until our clothes were dry, then moved upriver, staying close to the shadows. My body screamed for rest, but something in me refused to stop. Maybe it was the way she moved ahead of me, sure and calm, like she could see a future I couldn't. Near midnight, we reached a grove of cottonwoods. The leaves shimmered silver in the moonlight, whispering secrets to the wind. We made camp there, no fire this time. The air smelled of wet stone and the faint sweetness of wild mint. She lay down first, wrapped in her blanket, eyes closing almost at once. I stayed awake, listening to the river, the frogs, the heartbeat in my ears. For the first time since I could remember, I didn't feel hunted. Not free either, just caught somewhere between the two, the way dawn sits between night and day. When sleep finally came, it came fast, like falling. I dreamed of fire and rope, of the tree where she found me. But this time, when the rope snapped, I didn't fall, I floated, carried by the same current that had saved us tonight. And in that dream, I heard her voice, soft as the river itself. "You stay, you live." If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. Days passed. The river became our road, winding, merciful, unjudging. We followed it north, leaving behind the graves of men and ghosts alike. The world around us changed slow, almost shy, as if unsure whether we deserved softness after so much violence. The grass grew taller, the wind lost its teeth. For the first time in months, the air smelled of rain instead of smoke. We drank from clear pools and ate what the land offered: roots, berries, sometimes a fish, if luck decided to show her face. At night, when the fire burned low, I caught myself watching Taya. She sat near the flames, eyes half closed, listening to the river's murmur like it was speaking to her. Maybe it was. The land seemed to understand her in a way it never would me. She belonged to it. I was still asking for permission to exist. On the 5th evening, we found a hollow beneath a great oak, a tree older than both our bloodlines combined. Its roots formed a shelter where the ground dipped low, dry even after the rain. Taya called it a good place. I didn't argue. She built a small fire while I fixed the old trapper's fence nearby. The rails were splintered, half-eaten by rot, but my hands were steady for the first time in years. There was something almost holy in the act of mending instead of breaking. We didn't talk much. The silence between us said more than words could, a language of shared breath, shared burden, and the quiet relief of survival. When dusk came, Taya sang in her tongue. Her voice was soft and low, carrying that aching kind of beauty that makes a man stop breathing just to listen. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the prayer. It was the sound of someone remembering what was lost and still daring to love what remained. When her song faded, she sat beside me and pulled something from her pouch, a necklace woven from feathers and thin leather cord. The feathers caught the firelight, pale gold against the dusk. "This," she said, placing it in my palm, "for those who choose to stay." I turned it over in my hand. "And what if the land don't forgive me?" "The land don't need to," she said. Her eyes met mine, steady, sure. "Only you." I didn't know how to answer that. Forgiveness had always felt like a luxury for better men. Somewhere beyond the trees, a hawk cried, a sound both lonely and alive. It drifted into the fading sky and was gone. I looked at Taya, then really looked. The scars along her arms, the quiet defiance in her jaw, the way the firelight touched her like it was afraid to burn. For the first time, I saw not what I'd done, but what I could become. Later, after we'd eaten, she leaned back against the roots of the oak, watching sparks rise into the dark. "You think ghosts follow us?" she asked. "Always," I said. "But maybe they get tired too." She smiled faintly. "Good. Then they let us rest." The fire popped. A shower of embers floated upward and vanished among the stars. I lay on my back, staring at the sky. The constellations looked the same as when I was a boy, steady, indifferent. Yet something felt different now. Maybe it was me. Maybe for the first time in my life, I wasn't running toward death or away from guilt. I was just here, alive. Taya reached into her pouch again and pulled out a handful of corn kernels, small and smooth. She let them roll through her fingers like tiny bits of gold. "Tomorrow," she said, "we plant." "Plant what?" "Corn." I couldn't help but chuckle. "Corn? In this dust?" She nodded, completely serious. "So we stay." The word stay landed heavy, almost foreign. It had been years since I'd stayed anywhere long enough to see a sunrise twice from the same horizon. She noticed my hesitation and shrugged. "Maybe corn grow, maybe not, but we try. That is living." Her certainty humbled me. I poked at the fire with a stick. "You really think the world'll let us?" "The world don't ask," she said. "It just waits." Her answer lingered in the air like smoke. The night deepened. The river whispered nearby, and crickets took up their endless hymn. I felt the exhaustion of months finally settle into something close to peace. My eyes grew heavy. Before I drifted off, she said softly, "You build fence, I build fire. Together, maybe we make a place." "Maybe," I murmured. "Maybe that's enough." I dreamed that night not of blood or rope or fire, but of open fields. The kind I'd seen as a boy before the war, before everything turned into survival. In the dream, Taya walked ahead of me, carrying a bundle of corn in her arms. The sun was rising, and the ground beneath our feet was soft and green. When I woke, dawn had come for real. Mist curled along the river, silver and cool. Taya was already outside, barefooted, her hands buried in the dirt.